podcast viewers, welcome to the latest episode of the CTO podcast. I've just got a short little snippet for you before we kick into the main content of the latest podcast. But a short apologies from me. I know it's taken a while longer than usual to get this episode up, but sometimes life gets in the way and slows things down. But here's the episode, the latest episode, episode 3, and it's a fantastic episode where I actually interviewed Jack Spargo, who's the CTO of CTO-Ohh. It's a really interesting one. It's quite a long one as well. And we recorded this a few weeks ago, but it's taken time just to kind of go through, approve it, and just make sure that I've got time to kind of produce it and get it up online. But here we are. As always, thank you for watching. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on, please hit the subscribe button. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks. So this week, we're joined by Jack Spargo, who's an experienced CTO, currently the CTO of CTO-Ohh, but with previous experience as well. Really fascinating kind of background, really interested in hearing the story of your time, Jack. But welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gareth. Thanks for having me. Great to be on the show.
Cool. So do you want to give us a bit of an introduction to yourself, Jack, and your background and your history?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as you said, I'm currently the CTO of CTO-Ohh. We're a fintech platform. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a bit. But my background, I guess I've been in the CTO role in some manner or other for around 4 years. Before that, I was the engineering manager and senior engineer. Tended to work across iOS, Ruby on Rails, and sort of front end in React. So I kind of was lucky enough to have roles that was always touching a few different technology stacks. I actually started off my career sort of in a fairly sort of non-traditional way, getting into software engineering. I actually went to, I studied aerospace engineering at university, and I'll be completely honest with you, it's mainly because I didn't know computer science existed, basically. And then I met a computer scientist at university and went, oh, I probably should have done that. But that was an interesting way in. And then I became a technology consultant, so working for sort of a big consultancy firm as a graduate, and sort of just gradually found myself getting closer and closer to tech projects. And sort of became a software engineer through that route, really, which was kind of interesting.
Cool.
So yeah, like I guess from early on, I always had the idea of, like, I always wanted to be writing code, working in software, but I also like the idea of, I guess, kind of, having a bit of oversight of the tools and platforms as well. So I think the CTO kind of always seemed like quite an attractive position to me, because it was, especially for the size of the companies I've tended to work for, they've all been relatively hands-on, which has been nice.
I guess that kind of leads me to the kind of standard question I ask everyone who comes on the show, which is, what is your definition of a CTO? What kind of makes a CTO for you?
Yeah, so for me, like, it really, like, obviously it's maybe stating the obvious, but I find that it's anything technology in the company. So, and the reason I say that, stating the obvious is perhaps sometimes it isn't. I think a lot of people, especially in tech startups, assume that it's sort of software development. And, that's it, build a product, off you go. But I think what I try and point out to some people is that it's also a lot about, like, where your data is and managing that, like your IT is, whether that's hardware, software, and also even just the things like in the early days, it's tech support as well. It's literally helping people get through. Tech is in, there's computers involved in everyone's role now in a company, and often you're the person who has to help get off the ground. Sometimes that can be just really simple things, but often, like, I found myself trying to help startups just do things like use Slack the right way, use email the right way, and maybe plug a few things together with things like Zapier and tools like that. So again, it's kind of often in the early stages, it can be a bit of being the IT guy as well as being the technology person.
Cool, yeah. I guess that's something that kind of comes up quite a lot, is the governance as well as the kind of the technical delivery. That governance piece is really kind of important, and it's something that some companies don't see, or some people don't anticipate, I guess, when they go into a CTO role. And it is hugely, hugely important, because as well as I do, that where you can store your data is just as important as how it's stored or what you store.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a huge piece.
The last couple of companies, including the current company, have been sort of fintechs, and it's so easy in that early MVP stage. Maybe it's a contract, or maybe it's an agency. And they've just, they've gone into AWS and they've just picked a region. It's usually US East 1, and then it's only way down the line when you start doing sort of compliance stuff, and they say, "Where is your data?" And you realise that you wish someone had ticked the UK box or the Ireland box. So yeah, absolutely. And one thing I thought was kind of interesting starting Control-Alt is that so before Control-Alt, I was doing fractional CTO work for a while, and one of the things they brought me in to help with actually, before I joined them full time, was to help them with some questions they'd have from investors around sort of what approach they were taking to cyber and what approach they were taking to data. And really, the agencies, they've been using a good agency actually, but it just fell outside their remit. It wasn't something for an agency to answer. So it was great to get in there sort of day one and help them set up some governance and policies. I'm pleased and I guess proud to say we've got like IT security policies from having a team of 6 and now we're 13, but it's a good starting point rather than trying to play catch up later on down the line.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll come back to the fractional CTO thing in a minute because I think it's really fascinating. But I totally echo what you're saying about the data governance there. I've been in several roles where, people have chosen online applications for the business or customer information and not thought about the price point and not thought about where is that data stored. And there was one place I was at where, we had customers all over the world, but so picking the actual region where we were storing our software and our data was really important, but also the third-party applications of where we were storing their data. And then, so, because if you end up in like one thing in India, one thing in Australia, one thing in the States, one thing in the UK or the EU, you're going to end up with so many territorial kind of clashes around data policies and agreements, and it's an absolute minefield. So it's something that I think every CTO should be totally aware of. But tell me about the fractional CTO thing, because how did that come about and what is it?
Yeah, great question. So I was CTO for a company called StrikePay, and actually that came about through them acquiring my company in 2021. So that was a really interesting experience to go through with that, and I guess I learned a lot about. Although I would call myself a CTO in my startup, it was it was just me. So I was very much like I guess sort of trying to think like a CTO, but without the team around me, if you like. And I guess I kind of taught myself a lot because I was thinking about growth. Then when I joined StrikePay and was in the role of CTO, it was a quick. There was a lot to learn, and small companies, these are small startups. Every startup I've worked up so far, including the ones where I've been in fractional, have all been fairly small, early stage. The biggest startup I've worked in was a Series A, but most were pre-seed and seed. And so I think I learned a lot about that kind of early structure and early ways to kind of go from being, a prototype, an MVP, or sometimes just nothing at all, to having something. A lot of the time as well, that the problem I was solving for these clients, I'll come on to how I got into it, but was actually around just how to take them from having maybe a no-code POC or maybe just some slides that demonstrated a concept to like having something they could put in front of users, customers, and also investors, I guess, as well, because a lot of the, especially the times we're talking sort of between 2021 and 2023 were times when it was hard to raise money, certainly 2022. So investors have been a bit more scrutiny. They wanted to see some proof that the product could be delivered. So how I got into it, actually, I was CTO at StrikePay. As I said, they acquired my business, Grazzi, and they were in the process of raising a round, and it was in late 2021, early 2022, and it sort of just didn't really come to fruition. So it was a sensible time for me to leave them sort of by mutual agreement. And I guess really like I had a few options then to go into other sort of maybe not necessarily CTO roles, but sort of senior engineering roles, and I just kind of felt like there was this gap. I spent a lot of time in the Ormo baths, big fan and proponent of the Ormo baths, and so I see a lot of very early stage companies, and just a lot of them were having this issue of, how do I maybe hire my first engineer, or how do I answer these questions for an investor who's got questions about my tech and how I'm going to build it and what product to use and all that kind of stuff. And so I guess I almost fell into it initially. I sort of said, well, I'm not going to jump into anything sort of pure, as an employee or as a founder straight away. So I had a few conversations with people in and around the Ormo Baths and in and around some of the networks of startups in Northern Ireland, and a few people just sort of said, well, look, I'm desperate to get an extra pair of hands on this. I think my first client actually was someone who was a technical founder, and he was getting a lot of. He was quite far through a kind of pre-seed raise, and just as you know, that takes up a huge amount of time. So he'd kind of had to completely pause the product build in order to do the raise, and was jumping back and forth. So in that particular example, I came in to just help continue building to his roadmap whilst he went and did the raise. So the first couple of gigs were fairly hands-on like that. And then really, I guess through some intros and stuff, I had a few more roles where I would be sort of asked. It was more around help us put together a hiring plan, or help us put together a plan on data, or a couple of places actually was, or one place in particular, it was more they had a technical problem. They're quite a big, very smart technology stack, but it had quite a tired UI, and they basically said, come and get our UI back on track. So, it's quite open-ended and I guess not that sort of well scoped by design. And that's useful again, because you come in with a kind of CTO mindset. You can sort of break that down into who do you need and how to approach it, and, what does success look like. So yeah, I guess it was very much a case of sort of making a decision to not make a decision initially, and then finding that these roles were there. And initially I sort of didn't call myself a fractional CTO. I called myself just a freelance developer or something. But what I realized is that the things people wanted me to help them with was the what I would consider to be CTO type responsibilities. So it was interesting actually, because I found myself with sort of two buckets of clients: the people that wanted to come in and solve a problem that they had defined, and the people that knew they had a problem and didn't know what the answer was, and was able to help both, which was a nice mix for me as well, because it was very much days of heads down, solve a problem, and days of conversations with people. And I think that's the other thing I'd add on that, is that everyone's got their own personality type and way they like to work. But for me, I'm very much in the middle of, I like to have conversations. I like working with people, but I also, that might be 2-3 days in the week, and the other 2-3 days a week, I want to sit heads down, have a hard problem to solve with technology, with code usually. So I find it's the size of companies that I work with and for, and the role that I've kind of carved out for myself, it's the good balance for me in that.
Yeah, I think that's the eternal struggle for every CTO is, how do you get that nice balance between doing the governance and the ownership and the strategic direction stuff, but also make sure you've carved out enough time for that kind of heads down, headphones on, I want to get lost in some technology because that's why I'm here. And I know that, that's something I struggled with in the past, was kind of moving away from the stuff that I loved, although I loved the kind of director stuff and the technical stuff of that point of kind of selling it to investors and meeting clients, and I loved all of that stuff. I did miss the kind of dwindling time to kind of get loose with the technology, because it's not something you can just dip into for 5 minutes. You need a good bit of time. And it sounds like from where you are in your journey and where you are in your role as a fractional, that you get to kind of continue that lovely balance and manage that yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for me as well, I think two roles I've had in the past, I've reached a point of the kind of career growth. This is once as a consultant and once in a sort of large startup. Um, both times I've got to a point in my career where my boss has said to me, look, you can't do as much hands-on stuff now. You need to, it's going to become more about managing teams that will do the doing and you'll do the management. And I completely get that, like lots of people do that. Lots of people love that. But for me, I felt like it was just I didn't want to have to step away from, getting into really some of the tough problems.
Yeah,
And I think going for sort of earlier stage startups, what they need actually is somebody who can do both. So that's good,
yeah,
and sometimes people sort of have said, "Well, what happens when Control Alt is got 50 engineers and stuff?" And um, that's a good question, but I think there's always a way to keep hands on, whether that's through making sure there's a small piece that you look after or can dip into, um, or if that's the hard problems are architecture and sort of um, some of the stuff that's higher level but still very technically minded and very sort of focus oriented. Um,
yeah,
it's interesting actually because we've been talking about the roles and levels and things recently, and looking at some of the stuff that Monzo has in their sort of career progression frameworks, and their like highest level, I think they call it like senior principal or something, still talks about having time to go, like still be able to go in and jump into some solve some technical problems, like either pairing or on your own. And I do
yeah,
think that's important. Actually, I have sometimes seen sort of usually larger tech businesses where um, when they're sort of senior technology leaders are too far removed, they sort of begin to just like you can lose the understanding of what's hard and what's not hard, what's a big bit of code and what's a small bit of code, and I think it's important not to kind of lose touch with that.
Can you tell us a bit about what you've been working on at Control Alt? You've said it's a fintech company and you've been doing stuff. Give us a bit of insight into that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so ControlOut's a really interesting company. Like we're a fintech company. We're building basically infrastructure, B2B, so business business infrastructure for alternative asset investment, really, and management. So um, it's quite a kind of like financially technical thing to describe, but at its kind of basic level, you have stocks and shares and bonds that are listed on exchanges, and then you have kind of everything else really, which is sort of classed as an alternative asset. So that might be things like I mean, traditionally we'd often say it might be things like wine or things that have value, property. What we also talk about though is things that might have value. So it could be like certain investments in companies, um, also things that like are hard to get raise money from traditional sources. So I think green tech is an example. Often people are trying to raise money to build a wind farm or a solar farm, and it's quite hard to just go to a bank and get a mortgage for that. But it's also hard to go and get an investor for that because the returns are sort of small, and so it sort of falls in this gap of people either have to put up the whole capital for these assets or none. Um, the problem we're solving then is the tokenization piece. So what we allow people to do is bring their asset to our platform. It gets tokenized and effectively broken into as many uh, smaller pieces as the person listing that wants, and then we can offer that to investors who can take a chunk in that. So if you take a wind farm as an example, they might be looking to raise £10 million to build a wind farm. We could potentially go and find 20 investors who are willing to put in £500,000 and tokenize it, and we can do that at way less cost and much quicker than if they were to go and do a very expensive process to registering that, getting it done by lawyers, and getting it all sort of set up in a way that allows it to be tokenized. If you I don't know whether you've ever bought or sold a house, but it's like if you think about the conveyancing process with that, imagine trying to
Mm.
do that if there were 10 buyers each trying to take a chunk. It gets very expensive and very complicated. So yeah, our platform effectively just allows people to bring these assets, tokenize them, and then investors come to our platform and are able to buy fractions.
Cool. And without giving away any of the secret sauce, what kind of tech stack are you using?
Yeah, so we're kind of building using TypeScript, and we're building, what we have is a platform of microservices that sort of do the interactions with the blockchain. We're using the blockchain, and also other things that we're doing around sort of the data storage pieces. And then we have a UI as well. So we have an investment terminal that we have our investors are able to log in and sort of check the value of their assets, place orders. Yeah, I guess I touched on the blockchain there. So we use the blockchain as a way of so one of the things that we have to do is make sure that we have a sort of a ledger that's not editable by us, if you like, so for trust reasons. And we've chosen the blockchain to do that. So there are kind of other options to do that, but we use the blockchain for that. And it's been interesting actually, because I think I was thinking about this. There's sort of three types of problems I think where people turn to the blockchain, and one is the sort of traditional, you're doing crypto or you're doing something, that is basically 80%, 90% blockchain and crypto. And then you've got there's a small bucket of people, maybe I'm being unfair on them, that I think sometimes use it for the gimmick factor. It's like a database would have been fine, but let's put it on the blockchain. And the third bucket, I think, is sort of where we fit into, with the likes of people like Ubloquity as well, based in Northern Ireland, who we use it to solve a very specific part of the problem. So, we could exist without the blockchain, and there'll be other solutions we could find. So we use it to solve a very specific part of the problem, and we found that to be a big learning curve, but actually it's very interesting to work with, very useful. And I probably was a bit skeptical coming into it, but I have been sort of convinced, I guess, about the usefulness of having a record, a public record that is immutable and unchangeable. There's some real value in that.
And just for our listeners who probably maybe don't know exactly what blockchain is, I mean, I know you've mentioned immutable kind of ledger there, but for the ones who don't kind of understand what it is or how it's applied, can you give us a brief summary of the technology and its applications? Because I think a lot of us have heard the gimmicks, especially maybe 10 years ago, where it was going to change the world, like everything that comes out. But yeah, can you give us a bit of an overview?
Yeah, absolutely. My description of this will probably horrify some sort of blockchain purists, but I like to go way back to almost like the simplest and explanation and the first principles. And so the way I describe it is that you basically have to think of the blockchain as a file on a file system. It just happens to be a very big file. I think it's most of them are sort of terabytes big now, and if you think of it like a big Excel file, what you're basically doing is every time you do a transaction or do an action, you're going and you're adding to that file. And again, if I like to think of it as my big Excel spreadsheet, I'm adding a row to it. And then the next one comes along, I'm adding a row. And so then obviously the next kind of challenge with that is, okay, well, how do I know the person adding a row is putting the truth in there? And that's where the whole kind of signing and cryptography comes in. So I say that I'm moving, thing A to thing B, whether that's an asset from wallet A to wallet B, or whatever principle you want to think about that your record is, your transaction. You basically sign it and say, I'm signing this. I say that this is what happened. It goes into this big file, as I describe it. And what happens is that file is stored sort of decentralized across lots of nodes across the internet. And they each validate that you are who you say you are when you add your transaction, and then they sort of sync up their big Excel spreadsheet across the world. But what that means that if someone comes along and tries to change that file, a malicious actor tries to change that row or a row in the past or try and change a value, then that the network as a whole, or the nearest node that malicious actor is talking to, is going to say, well, let me check your signature, you know. And the first thing to say is you can't change a record. So if they say, I want to change a record, it doesn't matter if you've got the right signature. The answer is no. If you're trying to add a record maliciously, so maybe you're trying to say that you transferred me some cryptocurrency that you didn't, then it will say, well, you don't have permission, therefore it's not been signed, and therefore it'll reject the transaction. So it's all like it's very much underpinned by this sort of the science behind cryptocurrency. So, you know, we often talk about crypto, and I think often it gets forgotten that cryptocurrencies is also cryptography. So the stuff we use whenever we use HTTPS in a browser, or check that an email is from, we say it is this concept of cryptography, where we have public and private keys. And that's what's really powerful in the blockchain, really, because that's what's used to say that the records you're writing are, you sign it with your private key, and then the public key is held in the record to say that, we know that was signed with the right key. So, it's a really interesting one. I'm sort of the distributed nature of it obviously adds a lot of challenges to things like, it's not always that fast to do. So, you have to sort of be wary of these sort of rights to the blockchain. And it's also quite noisy sometimes, because everyone's using a blockchain and sort of moving their transactions around. But sort of fundamentally, it's a really useful way of sort of recording ownership of something in a way that you're not the custodian of that data.
I suppose that's kind of, from my point of view, that's really interesting to understand. Is this a specialism you had, or is this something that you kind of learned for this role at Control-Alt? And if it was, how did you then because it's something that CTOs, and I know I've done it as well, we have to learn new technologies pretty fast at times.
Yeah.
And get it right. And how did you go about doing that? What was your your process for absorbing all that information and applying it?
Yeah, well, first of all, to answer your first part of that question, it was very new to me here. I had a kind of passing interest in it. Probably read a few blog posts, never touched it other than that. And then when I started, obviously initially I was I can't remember if I said this, but I initially started consulting for Control-Alt in June last year, I think, before I went full time in October. But initially I thought, well, I've got a bit of a steep learning curve here. So the way I sort of approached it, and the way I've approached other problems like this in when you're having to quickly get up to speed on something that you're not an expert in, especially in the CTO space, is sort of try and bring it back to the kind of first principles, like what is it here, and B, sort of trying to make sure that you only go as deep as you need to initially, just because of the time pressures. So for example, like when I was first getting up to speed with some of the stuff around reading and writing to the blockchain, a lot of the things go down the routes of smart contracts and how to write these very deep, complex sort of on-chain methods and on-chain applications. And I sort of was thinking, I don't need to know that yet, actually. So this is probably the point where I don't go any deeper into that part and move on to the next sort of area to go down into. And I think one thing I've often said to some of our sort of junior team members who are also getting this for the first time is fundamentally a lot of what we're doing is working with APIs. What that API does might be very different, and might be something extremely complicated, or it might be something extremely simple. But a lot of what we do is, is there an API for it? And if yes, like what does that look like? What are the commands? What are the methods? Thankfully, most of these things, including working with the blockchain, they have good developer docs, so you can go and sort of read about them and then sort of try them out. So I think that's definitely it. I think the final thing I'd say on that is that everyone has different learning styles, and I try and be quite aware of engineers on my team, I always try and sort of have a vague understanding of what each person's learning style is. Mine personally is very much like, I need to try it out. I need to test. I need to sort of go and I need to download the Hello World example and get Postman and hit some things and see what responses I get. And that's my way. Obviously, other engineers and other CTOs do it very differently. Some like to read all the docs and make notes. Some like to do it very interactively, so have calls. And I think I've probably in the past been the bane of sort of sales engineers from various places who have said, "Do you want to call with our integrations team?" And I've said, "No, thanks. Just give me a Hello World example and some docs, and I'll come with how many questions." So it's I think it's interesting though. I think it's just when you think you've got sort of you'll never know everything, and that's you wouldn't want to. You're never going to be an expert on everything. I think the reason I say that is because I think one of the important things I learned, probably pre being a CTO, but certainly it stuck with me through being a CTO, is that you're never going to be an expert on everything, and you're probably going to be an expert on very little. I mean, not to do us down, but your experts should be your individual contributors, your principal engineers who are deep focus on a certain area. I think it's sometimes our job as CTOs to sort of stay broad, stay with a wide focus across everything, and only go down as sort of deep as we need to.
I totally agree. I think, it's one of the challenges that separates, especially people coming into a CTO role from an engineering background, and as most of us do. And kind of, we talked before about the balance and trying to keep that balance, but there's also that kind of psychological leap of, I am not going to be an expert at everything, and I can't humanly be an expert at everything, because you're just going to end up kind of killing yourself by burning out trying to learn everything under the sun. And then if you're doing that, you're probably missing the point of being a CTO in the first place. But that's really insightful. You mentioned your team there, and you mentioned how everyone's different and their training techniques different. I'm a bit like you. I'm the hands-on. I still buy books as well. And I will lounge around at weekends, listening to music and reading large kind of document books and kind of understanding the technology, and then go, right, I'm ready for a Hello World. I'm ready to dip in. Let's get hands on with it and get it working. It's kind of mine. But, to talk more about the team, you've obviously got a growing team there. The world of recruiting tech staff, tech team members, colleagues has changed in the last 4 years dramatically. I know that, it's a real challenge for every CTO out there. With hybrid working, remote working, how have you found that? How have you found the kind of transition, especially from transitioning to a new kind of company? And second to that, I guess, how do you make that work? What's your magic?
Yeah. It's been really interesting, actually. I think because I sort of left employment to start my own startup just at the sort of, I think it wasn't long after the beginning of the pandemic. So I'd gone from fully 5 days in the office, no question. Of course it's going to be 5 days in the office. Why wouldn't it be? To suddenly fully remote, the pandemic. And then I left to start my startup. And I never really went back into an office. And obviously in the years since, 2021, as that was then, we've gone from sort of everyone's remote and that's fully remote and will always be remote to sort of coming back now to hybrid and some element of in office being, certainly coming back in. What we've done at Control-Alt is we've got pretty much always had some element of in office. So the team, before I started, so I should say half the team. So the non-engineering and product side of the team are based in London, and then the product and engineering team are based in Ireland, actually. So some of us are in Belfast, and some of us are based out of Dundalk. So you've immediately got this challenge of like, well, none of us could all be in the same place 5 days a week anyway, really, because we're all 300 miles away. But what we do is we make sure that as a company we get together once a quarter
Mm-hmm.
for an offsite, and we'll have a day or two set aside to go through strategy and hiring and things we want to address as a company. And then what we do is every week we meet as a product and engineering team in Dundalk. So we have an office in Dundalk. We meet there. So that's the chief product officer, myself, the 4 engineers we have, and a product and ops manager we have. So we all get together and we try and do as many of the meetings that we might do throughout the week on that day, and just generally have a lot of sort of organic conversations about things. One thing I'd say is that the team we have right now, we have 2 graduates on our team who graduated last summer. So this is their sort of first graduate job. Now they did most of their degree remotely, which is
Right.
which is interesting. For those of them that did placements, they did those primarily remotely. So they sort of have fully remote as a norm. So
Okay.
in many ways, the bit that I hadn't expected to be a challenge is the fact that actually convincing people that have only ever known fully remote that it's useful to have sort of in-person conversations isn't as easy as I thought it was, because I guess I assumed that everyone had this concept of, oh, well, that we used to all work in an office. So, there's some normality to that. But what we found, I think, I won't speak for them, but I think they understand how useful it is just to have someone that you can turn around and chat to and overhear conversations and join in, and sort of just that thing of leaning over to an engineer next to you and saying, like, can you help me with this? Especially
Yeah.
early on in the career, I think is really crucial. The other thing as well is I find that it does help with the other 4 days. So that day where we get together, we're going to have lunch together, have a coffee, we'll chat about, we'll have the kind of, the water cooler chat as well. Just helps make those conversations and chats the other 4 days a little more sort of natural, I guess. It becomes less of a formality to have a conversation with your team. People are very happy to just quickly jump on a Slack huddle or whatever it is. So I think it's really important. I've found it's really important to have some element of in-person contact, and it doesn't even have to be as much as once a week. I've seen people make it work with once a month or once a quarter. For us, I think because of the stage we're at and the kind of speed of iteration, once a week works really well. So I think that's been it's been a big learning for me actually, because I think, as I say, I kind of left bigger tech when everyone was in office. Then I went to smallish startups with lots of remote action, and then now we're trying to settle into this sort of this good rhythm.
Being in a company which was full flight, kind of constantly in the office before the pandemic, adapting to the pandemic, and then dealing with the kind of the challenges of coming back from that. I've always, especially for graduates and trainees, being concerned that they're not getting the best experience because they're not in an office, not because of, not because it's kind of necessary to be somewhere, but to have those human interactions, to have that coaching with a senior developer, and also for those senior developers and more middleweight developers to get that experience of coaching a younger kind of employee or a less experienced employee is crucial. And it's a real kind of challenging area. So that's a really insightful kind of view.
Yeah, I definitely found that because it's interesting what you said there, because I remember when we first went remote in the pandemic, the ones that myself and the other engineering leaders were worried about were the graduates and those early on in their career, partly for the reasons you said, around like the getting the kind of the interactions that they need to grow from more senior members of the team, but also partly because often their living conditions, whether they were living in shared houses or living at home, and they didn't quite have the space to, they would maybe be spending 20 hours a day in a bedroom, so we were worried about that. And I think it's interesting now seeing this next sort of batch of graduates come where they're so adapted to to working from home, learning from home. That it's interesting, and it's some of the sort of just some of the things you and I would naturally expect of being in an office. They don't necessarily have that kind of that grasp on, so like it's interesting to see that kind of how that plays out. I think the other thing I was going to say on that is that the coaching bit you mentioned about the other developers taking that mentor role. We've had to get better as a kind of at spotting the signs of those engineers that maybe need someone to sort of help out. I sort of remember that when I was in an office and I was an engineering manager, I would be able to sort of just look around my team, and I could see who was maybe, especially the more junior ones, who was maybe getting stuck. This head in their hands, big size, or maybe just look at the same thing, maybe just a bit, reserved, and you'd be able to say, how's it going? Everything all right? And they go, do you know what? I've been stuck on this thing for 2 hours and I'm hitting my head against it. And you'd be able to say, oh, cool. And you'd either be able to help them, or you'd be able to say, hey, do you know what? Who knows this inside out? It's this person here. So, and obviously that person would have heard. So they go, oh yeah, what's the problem? And they jump in. And one thing I've found that we've had to get better at is just sort of, checking in on people, like, how's that thing going? Do you need any help with that? Getting that balance right, because if you just, if every hour you're saying, hey, where's that ticket? Or even if you say, how's it going? That gets read as, oh, I'm going too slowly, I'm being chased, which is also not what you want for people early on in their careers. So we've had to try and develop sort of, I wouldn't quite say techniques, that probably gives them a bit too much credit, but just sort of some tips and tricks to help us get a feel for who needs a bit more support and who is happy and is on course and is working away, and a bit like learning styles. One person might want to sort of get stuck and solve them for themselves, and yes, it might make that task take a bit longer, but then they've learned that and they're going to never forget that. Other people, it's their learning technique and their personality type that actually they do want someone to sit with them, and they want to pair, they want to do that, and neither is preferable. It's just understanding who has which style, and therefore which ones to kind of offer that help to, and which ones to just step back and say, look, I'll let them come to me.
Yeah, there's a certain part of our role now which is looking more for indicators of, can we explore something a little bit without kind of going off onto a 1 hour long rabbit hole kind of,
yes.
Well, this is how you actually code this, and it becomes a tutorial. But no, you're definitely right. I think, I think we're still trying to find that balance. And it's really great to get your insight into how you're kind of working with that, especially with a remote team like that. It's really, really interesting. Cool, Jack. That's kind of all the questions that I have. Not that it's an interview process, but is there anything else you want to talk about while we're on?
I don't think so. I think that's all good, actually. I think that's I think we covered all the main areas. Yeah.
It was really, really good, mate. Thanks a lot. It
Good
was really
stuff.
cool.
Thank you.